Thanks very much to Matt and Jeff for inviting me back. As you see, the title has changed a little bit. Extremely Violent and Perilous Weather on PUDDN'HEAD, Wilson, and Hydropower, but my placeholder title is still basically corrected, so I'll talk about Twain. And I'm glad with Catherine to represent Twain at this conference, which I feel like is like part of somehow like appeasing the ghost of Mark Twain, that we have to have a couple of direct Twain content. Okay. In a hand-scrawled note to his printer, Mark Twain proposed a curious preface for his novel, PUDDN'HEAD Wilson. To save the space usually devoted to explanations of the state of weather in books of this kind, the author begs leave to substitute a simple system of weather signs. The hieroglyph at the head of each chapter will instantly convey to the reader's mind a perfect comprehension of the kind of weather which is going to prevail below. We don't know why this passage and corresponding symbols didn't appear in the published book. Perhaps Twain or his editor deemed them redundant, since Twain slipped a similar witticism into his previous novel, The American Claimant. Quote, "No weather will be found in this book. Nothing breaks up an author's progress like having to stop every few pages to fuss up the weather." Writing to his publisher in 1893, Twain promoted the newly completed PUDDN'HEAD Wilson in similar terms. Quote, "There ain't any weather in it and there ain't any scenery. The story is stripped for flight." Yet the proposed preface would have added a strange, new, and as I will argue, important twist on Claimant's earlier conceit. Twain instructed his printer to intersperse the symbols throughout, and that it was, quote, "not necessary that they fit the weather of the chapter always." Weather would hardly have been excluded. It would have been everywhere. In a previously published version of this paper, I sought to contest new materialist frameworks for thinking about non-human agency. For both Bruno Latour and Jane Bennett, water and weather are quintessential non-human actants whose power we are called on to recognize in what they would consider a crucial anti-anthropocentric reframing. In this light, Twain's occlusion of weather might suggest the need for a new materialist corrective. I argue that, on the contrary, weather's oscillation between mere scenery and crucial actant in fact underscores how such non-human forces are shaped by and cannot be interpreted outside of all too human political structures. Revisiting this piece now, and for the possibly like one person who's read the article version, I'm trying to kind of freshen this up for the book version, so I'm glad to have this chance to put it in dialogue with Energy Humanities. So revisiting this piece now, I build on this point to show how PUDDN'HEAD Wilson's weird weather underscores Twain's attention to the specifically political economy of energy. The Energy Humanities' well-established historical materialist bent helps us see even more clearly how Twain's work troubles well-meaning but misguided works in ecocriticism, 19th-century American studies, and vitalist strains of black studies that continue to make disturbing recourse to salvific fantasies of lively matter. All right, kind of like Catherine, this is where I have to do this plot summary of a book that like doesn't make any sense when you hear it in summary. But anyway, PUDDN'HEAD Wilson recounts the arrival of aspiring lawyer and surveyor David Wilson in the Missouri town of Dawson's Landing. A poorly received joke earns him the moniker Pudd'n'head from locals who are as underwhelmed by his supposed legal and scientific expertise as they are by his Yankee wit. But Wilson's hobbies of fingerprinting and palmistry ultimately help him solve the murder of one of the town's scions, Judge Driscoll. The judge, as Wilson eventually reveals, was killed by a man the townspeople know as Tom, the judge's nephew. But Tom is in fact the biological offspring of the judge's slave Roxy, who had swapped the judge's nephew with her own son, valet de chambre, or Chambers, soon after birth. As critics have noted, Twain's complex plot, which also includes the remnants of a farce about Italian twins, produces a sense of confused identity and tangled bloodlines that burlesque the pseudoscientific basis of Jim Crow segregation. Oh, I forgot to give you a picture of the book. That's the book. Given, as we have just heard, the centrality of coal mining to the narrative of the Gilded Age, and the overt focus on rivers and their flows in Life on the Mississippi and, of course, Huck Finn, PUDDN'HEAD might seem a strange novel to focus on if looking for Twain's take on energy. All the more so given his brag that the book has no interest in literary environments, aka scenery. Yet PUDDN'HEAD Wilson quickly gives the lie to this supposed omission, even without the planned hieroglyphics. In the sections of the novel set in 1830, Percy Driscoll, the judge's brother, maintains order on his plantation by threatening to sell his slaves out of the supposedly mild forms of bondage that characterize life for black people in Dawson's Landing. And when a few items go missing from his home, Driscoll quickly elicits a string of confessions through the almost incantatory power of the phrase, "down the river." Name the thief. I give you 1 minute. He took out his watch. If at the end of that time you have not confessed, I will not only sell all 4 of you, but I will sell you down the river. It was equivalent to condemning them to hell. No Missouri Negro doubted this. Roxy reeled in her tracks. The others dropped to their knees. I done it, I done it, I done it. Have mercy, master. Lord, have mercy on us. Very good. I will sell you here, though you don't deserve it. You ought to be sold down the river. In many ways, Driscoll's threat is the plot's prime engine. The thought of being separated from her infant is what motivates Roxy to risk swapping her son for the Driscoll heir. Perversely, it is Tom himself, not knowing he is black and an impostor to his name, who later sells Roxy downriver when she selflessly offers herself as chattel to pay his gambling debts. Tom is amazed by his luck that the woman he thinks of as his mammy would allow herself to be re-enslaved. She had been set free earlier upon Percy's death. Yet she willingly makes the sacrifice for the boy she knows to be her son. Little does she know, however, that Tom has conspired to sell her not to a putatively pleasant situation as a servant in an upcountry farm, as he promised, but to a plantation in Arkansas. Significantly, Roxy's awareness of this betrayal comes from a simple observation about the ripple patterns in a flowing river. It had been imagined that she would not know, and would think she was traveling upstream. Why, she had been steamboating for years. She passed many a snag whose break could have told her a thing to break her heart, for it showed a current moving in the same direction that the boat was going. But at last the roar of a bigger and nearer break than usual brought her out of her torpor, and her practiced eye fell upon that telltale rush of water. Then her head dropped upon her breast, and she said, "Oh, the good Lord have mercy, I sold down the river." In the first U.S. edition of the novel, the scene is accompanied by a sketch of the river's current breaking around a protruding log. Since we only have 3 people on our panel, we had 4, I have time to give Matt a pop quiz. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that even though the novel describes this as a snag, the illustrator has made an error. And what would we call that log if not a snag? You can do it. Come on. You know your Mississippi River lore. A snag should be facing upriver, right, but this is facing downriver, which would make it. You can do it. No. It's a Sawyer. A Sawyer. Yeah. yeah. I think, if I'm not mistaken, which makes them both less dangerous because if it points up, it's more likely to gouge the hull of a ship, but in some ways more dangerous because it will bob below the river, and so it's like a harder thing to navigate around. Anyway. In the first U.S. edition of the novel, the scene is accompanied by a sketch of the river's current breaking around a protruding log. The waves begin to the north of the obstruction, creating a break fanning out in a V pattern, which allows Roxy to see that the boat she is on is moving with the river's southward flow. Now, what, you might ask, has this got to do with energy? I was going to say, now what, Jeff might ask, has this got to do with energy? And I say, Jeff, give me a break. Just be patient. I'm going to get there. In an argument I need hardly rehearse for this crowd, Andreas Malm's Fossil Capital challenges dominant accounts of the rise of the fossil fuel economy. Malm, of course, shows that the move to fossil fuels was not simply a response to some innate human need for more energy or some natural effect of population growth or scarcity of resources, but was downstream, as it were, of class conflict, of capital's need for mobile and manageable labor. Malm's tome performs in its very bulk a certain anxiety about amassing a historical archive sizable enough to displace the Malthusian-Ricardian paradigm. But one of his most striking conceptual interventions comes when he underscores how profoundly we are led astray if we focus on the physical qualities of energy resources without understanding their inflection, indeed transformation, by social relations. This comes in his description of how water and coal appear from the perspective of capital. There is a striking paradox here. The flow of water was in a state of motion by nature, as Babbage put it. The stock of coal was utterly static. Yet from the standpoint of cotton capital, as it accumulated in space, the flow was stationary and the stock on the move, the still and the restless transposed. And this for Malm also has a temporal correlate. This can only imply that capitalist property relations of early 19th century Britain had produced their own form of temporality, which after entering a moment of acute contradiction had to reorder nature. Neither the export to distant markets nor the profit motive, the exigencies of fixed capital, the need to regulate the speed of machinery and fill in every hour with maximum labor emanated from nature. The other way around. They had to construct and rearrange nature out of the materials at hand. Rivers move across a landscape. From the perspective of capital, they are too fixed in one spot. A mill has to be by a river. Piles of coal stay still. From the perspective of capital, they can go anywhere. Rivers flow. From the standpoint of capital, they might stop at any moment. Piles of coal stand still. From the perspective of capital, they are always ready to spring into action. We can now begin to see how it requires only some flexibility of terminology to say that Pudd'n'head Wilson is, it turns out, a novel about hydropower. Walter Johnson, after all, has argued that a focus on steamboats might reshape our understanding of the geography of industrialization in the United States. The mills of Lowell used energy according to a formula that was thousands of years old. They used the force of gravity to channel water through the downward flow of miles of canals to power their works. Steamboats turned wood and water against gravity. They took the materials from which the mills were built, remixed and combusted them, and produced enough added force to drive a 500-ton steamboat upriver. It is upriver travel that profoundly remade the temporality and spatiality of nature, making rivers a bidirectional infrastructure for the movement of people and commodities, and people as commodities. Yet downriver travel too, by virtue of this transformed relation, takes on an intensified and expanded role that in some sense remaps the materiality of the river itself. A major strain of contemporary ecocriticism and political theory often yearns to imagine that, because non-human forces limit the dominance of man, they are a kind of ally to subaltern people. One sees this especially in accounts of maroon communities, for example, for whom swamps and rivers are said to function as a kind of ally, impeding colonization or whisking fugitives to freedom. Yet here, the physical flow of the river, the transformed relations of the internal slave trade amid the cotton boom, all come to function less as some natural law, some radically vibrant matter, some anti-hubristic actant, than as a mechanism for disciplining and coercing labor. This power dynamic, not a vernacular actor network theory, is what Roxy reads in the river's flow. One picture of this inflection of hydropower, our picture of this inflection of hydropower sharpens when we consider how steam power as the engine of the internal slave trade thus posed a problem for capital, but also its partial solution. This is Walter Johnson again. No form of inland transportation, the historian Lewis Hunter wrote, has been more bounded by geographic limitations than the river steamboat. The outer limit of the Mississippi steamboat economy annually expanded and contracted with the climate. Malm discusses how, before the transition to coal, manufacturers considered elaborate plans to make rivers more reliable. Catch basins and dams would ensure a stable flow. Johnson records parallel efforts to manage the Mississippi to keep upper reaches of the system navigable. But the mills of Manchester had in effect a simpler, if not wholly reliable method for adjusting for the whims of the weather. Malm again. Put differently, the proprietors of water mills absorbed the weather swings by dint of their unrestrained command over labor power in time. Robert Hyde Gregg declined to give details, merely stating that in weeks of droughts or floods, his hands were paid the full amount of wages, knowing that we shall have the power of working up the time that has been lost. But that power really could not be taken for granted. Wielding the full force of slave law, steamboats subject to fluctuations in water also transported the unfree workers whose labor would continue, weather be damned. As Karadagat has shown us, the very concept of energy facilitates such grim calculations across disparate forms of fungible work, of rivers and steam and people. Returning to Twain in his odd preface then, we might say that Pudd'n'head Wilson reveals that indifference to weather treated as the stuff of phatic chit-chat, mere filler, easily dispensed with. Indifference to weather is a historicizable affect and affectation, one that indexes tensions and shifts within an energy regime that was always also a labor regime. In the omitted preface, Twain goes on to elaborate a mock scientific system of weather signs. When two or more signs occur together, the ensuing weather is going to be more, or more yet, or still more variable, according to number of signs employed. When all the signs are used, it means stormy. When they are doubled, it means extremely violent and perilous weather. When there is no sign, it means that there is not going to be any weather. It is a mistake to suppose that weather is at all times necessary in a novel. As often as not, it is an inconvenience and keeps the characters from going out. This wry catalog encapsulates the logic that fossil capital exposes. Weather becomes a variable to be managed, an inconvenience that interrupts circulation. Twain's jest could be said to naturalize a social transformation, the reorganization of nature's variability into an instrument of labor discipline and maximization. The possibility that there is not going to be any weather is the fantasy of the fossil capital regime that was already on the horizon, the dream of energy freed from season, flow, or place. Yet in Pudd'n'head Wilson, weather and scenery also return in a river's flow breaking around a snag as the medium through which the coercive order of labor and energy becomes visible.